And now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. D.C. Schindler. Very grateful to have him here. His work is concerned above all with shedding light on contemporary cultural challenges and philosophical questions by drawing in the resources of the classical Christian tradition. His principal thematic focus is metaphysics and philosophical anthropology, but he also works in political philosophy, phenomenology, the philosophy of science, of religion, and philosophical theology. His main historical areas are ancient Greek philosophy, especially Plato and Neoplatonism, German philosophy of Hegel and Heidegger, and Catholic philosophy, especially Aquinas and 20th century Thomism. Dr. Schindler studied the great books as an undergraduate at Notre Dame, received a master's degree in theology at the John Paul II Institute, and then completed his education with a master's degree and PhD in philosophy at the Catholic University of America. After teaching for 12 years at Villanova, first a teaching fellow in philosophy and a founding member of the humanities department, Dr. Schindler returned to DC to teach philosophy courses at the Institute. He's published more than a dozen books. He's an editor of the English language edition of Communio and a board member of the Review of Metaphysics and New Polity, a translator of books and articles from French and German, a fellow for the Institute for Human Ecology, and so much more, and explained to me yesterday that the opposite of symbol is the diabolical, which I thought was pretty amazing. So please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Good morning. It really is a privilege and an honor to be here. I had heard about CiRCE. This is my first experience of it from the inside, and as you all know, it really is quite an organization. The energy, one does get a lot of hope when you see this movement for classical education. I mean, it's alive, and the energy here, and you understand it all when you meet the man behind it, the family behind it, and again, it's really a privilege to be able to address you. My talk is called "The Symbol of Authority," and there are going to be a couple of sort of philosophical turns here. I'm glad it's in the morning when the coffee is just kicking in. Some of this will be maybe a little unfamiliar ground for some of you, but I think the basic moves of the presentation should be obvious and intuitively sort of graspable, and that's really what I'd like you to hold on to mostly. But so, to begin, no one, it seems to me, would dispute the fact that we're currently undergoing a crisis of authority, if not on a global scale, at least at a hemispheric scale. And this is something the newspaper, if you still receive a newspaper, brings evidence of every morning. Now, it seems to me that while the scope is clear, I think this crisis is unprecedented in history, in its depth and pervasiveness. Even those who desire to keep order in the various spheres of human existence no longer, I think, experience in a spontaneous way the inwardly compelling force that we all recognize ought to emanate from traditional figures of authority. So we find ourselves attempting to compensate by appeals to assertions of coercive power, which is more obvious and seems to be more effective than mere authority. Don't we witness such a fading of the inner strength, dignity, and manifestness of authority, not only in the political sphere or in the public rule of law, but also in matters of religion and morality, in the intimacy of family life, in culture, in public commentary, and of course, in a special way, in the delicate task of education? It seems fair to say, more generally, that our sensitivity to the natural authority of the true and the good has been dulled, so that even when we exert ourselves to conform to them, we do so more by our own efforts than by the felt strength of authority. I think this is something we can all relate to. So it's just this pervasive thinning and loosening of the bonds of authority that tie us together, not only as citizens, but members of a family, of a community, and ultimately, of course, of the body of Christ. A loosening even of the bonds that constitute our acts of understanding and the movement of our heart. This loosening, I think, is unprecedented in history. Because this crisis evidently concerns something so fundamental in human existence, it's remarkable how little attention appears to have been given to it, even in the rising floodwaters of commentary that we are inundated with through social media and technology. So what is going on here? In matters of such depth, it's generally not very fruitful to try to identify some specific discrete cause, especially if one hopes to propose a tidy solution to the problem. So rather than seek a simple cause or a program of action in response, what I'd like to do here is to contemplate power. More specifically, to reflect on the nature of authority, which I'm going to distinguish from power. That's going to be an important step. I'm going to try to offer an interpretation of what authority is. And the hope is that if we better understand it, we'll have a better sense of what's missing in our shared assumptions about authority, and maybe even get an intuitive sense of at least how we might start to think about responding to this crisis. So I'll have three parts to this presentation. The first one is authority and its reductions. Let's enter our reflection by distinguishing authority from what is no doubt its most compelling substitute, namely power. Power and authority are clearly very closely connected. But I think in spite of this close relationship, to fail to see what distinguishes authority from power is already to slide into this crisis, the forgetfulness of authority. Why? Authority is not simply a holder of power, because there's a difference between power that's derived from authority and a power that simply imposes itself without authority by the sheer force of violence. A holder of power might be such simply for having seized control and retaining the means to maintain it. So it's precisely this, in contrast to this display of power, of violence, that we speak of authority. Authority is one who has the right to exercise power, which is to say that his use of power is justified. It's an expression of justice. All right? It's not only that, but that's essential to it, that it is an expression of justice. Now, what does this mean? This means that what distinguishes authority from mere power is the appeal to a norm, a rule, a standard that transcends the user, a standard by which he himself is measured. That's what distinguishes authority from power, I'm suggesting. This transcendent norm is the crucial point, and one could really unfold in great depth implications of this. But I want to emphasize that because it seems to me that one can be tempted, especially in our democratic age, to think that what ultimately legitimates power, and so gives it authority, is the consent of the governed. But taking a cue from Plato, it's not, one could fairly easily show that unless there is some acknowledgement of a transcendent measure, it's not possible in the end to sustain any meaningful distinction between eliciting consent through persuasion and doing so through manipulation. And I think this is why there's such an ambiguity, for example, in the Me Too movement, which is all about consent. How do you know what's good consent and what's bad consent? Ultimately, you're not going to be able to make any distinction unless you appeal to something that has an objective norm, like chastity. Otherwise, it becomes a mess. Authority neither derives from consent, nor is it simply forced on those who are governed in blunt indifference to their willingness. Instead, authority requires some acknowledgement, some free recognition, precisely for it to operate as authority. So authority has to be freely accepted. But the authority, the existence of the authority doesn't depend on that acceptance. It precedes it. So it's both free, but more than freedom, more than free, you might say. Hannah Arendt, a wonderful political philosopher from the 20th century, and one of the most insightful theorizers of authority, captures, I think, nicely the middle ground that authority occupies between sheer force on the one hand and sheer consent on the other hand. So here's a quotation from Hannah Arendt. "Since authority always demands obedience, it is commonly mistaken for some form of power or violence. Yet authority precludes the use of external means of coercion." And we've heard this in other presentations. Where force is used, authority itself has failed. Authority, on the other hand, is incompatible with persuasion, which presupposes equality and works through a process of argumentation. Where arguments are used, authority is left in abeyance. Against the egalitarian order of persuasion stands the authoritarian order, which is always hierarchical. If authority is to be defined at all, then, she says, it must be in contradistinction to both coercion by force and persuasion through argument. All right, so we know what it's not. What is it? We'll get to that. What creates this middle ground, I want to suggest, is the recognition of a transcendent norm, which is distinct both from the individual who would impose a rule by force and from the individuals who would allow a rule only in conformity to their own determination. We've got a third thing, a measure, a norm. What are the implications of this? One of the implications of having this transcendent norm or measure is that it opens up an essential role to the intellect in the phenomenon of authority. The exercise of genuine authority is never the function of an arbitrary will, whether it be the will of a tyrant or even the will of the people, understood as arbitrary. Instead, it's always a will that's been constrained, or to put it better, illuminated, informed by a transcendent principle of order that's accessible to the intelligence. I think that this opens up a really helpful insight into what authority is and one of its essential features. And this is going to become really thematic in this presentation, that authority involves both intellect and will operating together in consort. Receiving a principle lying above, through the understanding, authority promotes the concrete realization of this principle through the will, in the order below. In an article written in 1973, which I think still is one of the best succinct presentations of the intellectual history of authority, not very well-known author Leonard Krieger explains that, quote, "In its origin, authority was essentially transitional. Its function was to bring principles from a higher realm of being to bear upon the activities in a lower realm of being. Ideas of authority modulated the principles so as to make them relevant without divesting them of their superiority." So notice how that's the middle ground that Hannah Arendt was talking about. What does this mean? Authority simultaneously bears witness to higher principles and mediates them, communicates them. The figure of authority makes manifest an order that lies above him, to which not only those in his charge, but he himself is subject. And he communicates that order, translating it into the appropriate terms, helping that order to come to expression in the sphere that's given to his responsibility. So here we see the etymological roots of the word. So authority, auctoritas in Latin, comes from the noun auctor, meaning author, right? Which is a reference to an intelligible plan, a divine author. And the word auctor itself comes from the verb augere, which means to make grow, to augment, where we get our word to augment. So what does this mean? Authority bears witness to an author, and doing so enables that plan of the author, the order of the author, to bear fruit in the flourishing of the lower realm of being. And this lower order then gives expression to that the higher principles. You think of a gardener here. A gardener doesn't just invent arbitrarily what's good for plants, right? He has to learn what's good for them. He doesn't, I'll try chocolate syrup, see how that works. You need to obey. The gardener himself obeys an order, but he translates them. So he translates it. He knows what's good and what's truly good for plants, then has to determine, well, what's good for these plants in this climate, in this particular place. And in doing so, if he makes that translation properly, the plants flourish. So the gardener is like an authority with respect to the plants. That's an analogy here. So notice that authority has two essential dimensions. On the one hand, it's a matter of understanding through the intellect, and on the other hand, it's a fruitful enactment of what's understood involving the will. So intellect and will. Now it's worth observing, and I'm going to come back to this later, that there's a third element, which is, you might say, the theological dimension. This is always, in some sense, with the reference to the author, the divine author, it's always theological in some basic respect, but I'll come back to that. We'll focus first on the two essential dimensions, understanding and will, intellect and will in authority. Once we see that it involves both of those things, I think it helps us to recognize typical reductions or impoverishments that we see in our culture in the understanding of what authority is. On the one hand, we have a reduction of authority to the mere intellect. That happens, I think, that's a rarer reduction. And then, on the other hand, a reduction of authority to the sheer will. That one is much more common, I think. But I want to talk about both of them. I'll begin with the reduction to the will. Because authority quite evidently concerns ruling in some manner, and therefore setting in order through command requiring obedience, and through the regulation of behavior through law, it's clearly a practical matter, a matter of praxis. But the temptation is to think that that's all that it is. It's simply a practical matter. And thus to reduce praxis just to a pragmatic form. Now, there are some interesting versions of this in the Middle Ages, which I won't burden you with. I'll just jump to the most paradigmatic expression of this pragmatic reduction of authority, which is very much with us, and that is in the figures such as Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes, who stand both at the dawning age of the Enlightenment. Hobbes, I think in particular, is worth focusing on. He famously claimed that, to use his Latin, he was a great Latinist, as it turns out, auctoritas non veritas facit legem. It's not truth, he said, but authority that makes the law. Okay, now I want to suggest this is a really problematic statement. It's not problematic one half of it is fine. When he says that the truth doesn't make the law, we can all understand that. Truth itself needs someone to interpret the truth, someone to enact it, someone to realize it. Truth itself can't create laws. But when he goes on to say that it's that authority, not the truth, makes the law, he's separating truth from authority. And for him, it's whoever makes the law is the authority, regardless of whether it reflects a higher principle or not. It's a purely pragmatic reduction. There's no understanding involved. It's entirely for him a matter of the arbitrary will. And it's not incidental that Thomas Hobbes is identified as the first one to explicitly and programmatically remove political philosophy from a theological context, to get God out of public life. He's the kind of a pivotal figure. Now, as experience reveals, the pragmatic reduction of authority can take a variety of forms, some hard, some soft, some involving outright violence through technology, military, but also some very subtle violence of manipulative rhetoric and marketing, which can take control of our desire and imagination. Whatever form it takes, in the end, the imposition of the arbitrary will of the one on the many, so tyranny, or the subjection of the one to the arbitrary will of the many, are both just versions of the same absence, loss of authority. There can be no authority distinct from power without a transcendent principle, which is something that the intellect needs to grasp. Okay, so this points then to the other side of the horse that we can fall off on, which is the theoretical or the intellectual reduction of authority. I said this is less common, but it's worth thinking about. A good example of this is a German philosopher I referred to positively yesterday in a presentation I gave. Here it's a more critical reference to him, Hans-Georg Gadamer, a philosopher from Germany of the 20th century. In reaction to what he calls the Enlightenment presupposition of a, quote, mutually exclusive antithesis between authority and reason, so this pragmatic thing that I was just talking about, Gadamer claims that, quote, authority has not to do with obedience, but rather with knowledge. If we give our assent to an authority regarding matters beyond what we are able to verify ourselves, he says, it can be called an assent to authority, properly speaking, rather than obedience, on two conditions. First, that it occurs as a reasoned judgment about the limits of our own knowledge. And second, it's something that in principle we could have figured out for ourselves. In principle we could have understood for ourselves. We just happen not to be in the right position, so we have to listen to someone else. You see, what happens here then is authority is just a matter of accidental where you happen to fall. It doesn't have something essentially good about it for Gadamer. As Gadamer puts it, quote, what the authority says is not irrational and arbitrary, but can in principle be discovered to be true. Now, I think his interpretation of authority, in a way, it's refreshing because it's a welcome alternative to the arbitrary and voluntaristic and irrational conception we get in the Enlightenment, which I think is very much the one that's still with us. But nevertheless, Gadamer's vision does not do justice to the reality. Let's recall Hannah Arendt. She insisted that authority ceases to be authority if it simply justifies itself by rational argument. You know, imagine a parent who will not have the children do something that they haven't first completely explained so that the child will do it on his own. In a way, that's no longer authority. Which isn't to say then that you force the child to do it. That's, again, falling off the other side of the horse. There's something in between those that we're still trying to get to. Just as in the previous reduction, authority disappeared for having become indistinguishable from power, now authority disappears insofar as it ideally gives way to a simple judgment of truth. So in the first case, the intellect turns out to have no vital, no strictly essential role to play in the exercise of will on either side of the authority relation. And in the second case, the will has nothing of its own to add to the simple exercise of truth, of the intellect, rather. So, what all this tells us is that authority will be squeezed out of any vision that does not have a place, and I think a properly central place, for the genuine unity of intellect and will, the integration of the orders of the true and the good. So all of this is a backdrop to the thesis that I would like to lay before you, which is the following. Authority is best and most fittingly understood as belonging neither exclusively to the practical order of the good, nor exclusively to the theoretical order of the true, but, you've guessed it probably, to the order of the beautiful, which the classical tradition has understood as binding the true and the good together in unity. Interpreting authority as a kind of realization, a making real of beauty, will yield some surprising results, which I will just sketch out in some broad strokes here, but I think it's something that I'm hoping myself and I hope others too might explore in more depth in the future. First of all, we'll see that authority does not simply call on the will, nor simply address itself to the intellect, but it in fact appeals to the whole person, soul and body, all of the faculties at once. Second, we will see that what essentially defines authority is the symbolic, its symbolic function, which is more fundamental than and in fact properly enables its secondary and derivative functions, to teach on the one hand and to command or govern on the other. So I'll be explaining those. Just want to state them first of all. But in order to get there, we first need to say a word about the nature of beauty. So, section 2, authoritative beauty. Big topic. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail in the history and the different interpretations of beauty here. It's an incredibly rich notion, but for the purposes of this presentation, first of all, I'm going to just focus on beauty in relation to this question of authority. That's the main interest. But I'll be drawing principally on the work of this, the theologian that's known as the theologian of the beautiful, Hans Urs von Balthasar. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he's written some great things on beauty. And the reason I'm drawing on him is he tries to synthesize the whole classical tradition with some modern insights. Okay, so his definition of beauty. Balthasar defines beauty in a really simple way. It's the form of splendor, or the splendorous form. Either one works. And what he means by that is an experience of beauty is when you see suddenly, imagine yourself walking by a tree that you've walked by 1,000 times, but one evening there's something about the color of the sunlight at dusk, say, and the breeze, and suddenly you catch sight of the tree in a wholly new way, and all of the elements of it just come together, and it takes your breath away. And you experience this, you see it all sort of coming together. So there's a form that suddenly presents itself to you, and it does so in a kind of a radiant way. There's a kind of light that shines out of it. That, for Balthasar, is what beauty is. Listening to music, we listened to some beautiful pieces yesterday, and you might hear the different melodies, but suddenly when you start to see how they're playing with each other and how they're really, suddenly you see the beauty of it sort of shines out to you. That's splendorous form. That's what Balthasar means by beauty. Now, one of the things that stands out most clearly in this phenomenon of beauty, and that's going to be really important to interpret authority, is that it represents a unity of things that we tend to think are opposed. Intellect and will, or desire, the mind and the senses, the soul and the body. I'm just listing, I'm not going to go into detail on these, just listing some of them. Being and appearance, interior depth and exterior manifestation, the finite and the infinite, the subject and the object, motion and rest. All these things that are opposites, they all come together in this really beautiful, rich way in the experience of beauty, it seems to me. And I mention all these just to try to evoke a sense of how paradoxical and rich the sense of beauty is. But the things that I want to specify now, specifically in relation to our theme, are the following. First, Notice, the experience of beauty engages our mind. Think about the discussion about the pieces yesterday. They were talking about it, thinking about it, right? It's something that engages the mind, but it does so in the way that's different from like working through a proof. We don't have the satisfaction of a simple conclusion, but our mind is still engaged, okay? Beauty sort of sets us thinking, you might say. It opens our mind to ponder and to savor these intelligible relations. Okay, second, beauty engages our desire, but it does so without specifically determining our will. So we speak of being moved by beauty. It's a movement that we're not initiating by ourselves, but we find ourselves already having been moved, already moving. It takes hold of us. Even though we can't say specifically where. Where is it moving us? It's moving us, but where? It's not specified in that way. Okay. Third, no matter what our beliefs may be, everybody would acknowledge that the profound experience of beauty evokes in us something of the divine. I was reading this totally secular theorist of beauty the other day from Harvard, and she just said, the first thing she said about beauty is it's sacred. And I thought, okay, so even she sees it. You can't deny it. Okay. It's an openness to a transcendent. Okay. Fourth, and this is a point that Balthasar gives special emphasis, beauty entails its own kind of necessity. Okay? It's not an extrinsic one in the sense that it conforms to extrinsically imposed rules, but it's an intrinsic one in the sense that when you see it, you experience that it's exactly right. So when you get, think again, the music, the way that it ends, you say, yes, that's exactly right. There's a kind of fittingness. It couldn't have ended in some other way, or if it did, that would have been exactly right. There would be something kind of compelling, an intrinsic necessity. No matter how unpredictable the last line of a poem or the ending of a symphony might be, we feel when it comes that it could not have been any other way. Okay, and then fifth, the experience of beauty is invariably one of affirmation, hope, and renewal. This same secular writer says it's life-giving. Augere. I'll come to that in just a second. Augere. Okay, so I want now for a moment to draw on Aquinas for a second to show why the experience of beauty is also always something surprising. Beauty takes us by surprise. According to Aquinas, beauty is the original cause, the principium of love. And in the sphere of philosophical anthropology, to limit it just to that, what is love? According to Aquinas, love is the reception of the form of the other into our desire, which causes us to conform to the beloved. We catch sight of the form of the beloved, and it conforms us. He calls this complacencia, being pleased with the other, not complacency that's a bad translation of complacencia, but being pleased with the other, this kind of fitting conformity, being tuned to the other. And he says that beauty causes that. And beauty for him brings this form. It's not the realization of a desire that we already had, like the desire I have for a sip of coffee, actually, which you satisfy and it's done. It's the introduction of a new desire. It's the introduction of something new. It gives us a new way of feeling and thinking. So Balthasar refers to the experience of beauty as an interplay of what he calls vision and rapture. Vision and rapture. We see it, the beautiful thing, and we're enraptured. We're moved, we're elevated up into it. And what's really interesting for him is that these are interconnected. They're not separable. We don't really see it unless we're moved by it, but we also are not moved by it unless we see it. And somehow both of these things happen at once in the experience of beauty, and it's a surprise to us. The This is what I think Plato meant in the Phaedrus by saying that beauty gives the rational soul wings. The rational soul wings. Notice that this surprise is not the surprise of an order or command being imposed on us coercively, violently from without. It takes us by surprise, it's something new and changes us, but in a way that we say, yes, this is fitting, this is right, this makes sense. Even though the judgment that it makes sense is sort of one that we make before we even think about it. One of the dimensions, I think, of that sense of fittingness, we have the sense of a transcendent mystery, a kind of divine stamp of approval. This is right. Okay. Now, given this description of beauty, it seems to me it's not so hard to see how it might fit with authority. As we've seen, authority doesn't impose order from the outside as coercive power. Instead, it communicates specifically an order that has been received rather than being spontaneously, forcefully, arbitrarily, and senselessly imposed. So this is the thing that Hobbes missed, that authority actually has an intelligible form at its heart. But the authority, if it makes sense, it doesn't do so in the sense of a rational proposition or like a geometrical proof or a syllogism. In that sense, it's different from a judgment of truth, as Gadamer thought. Arendt, we recall, insisted rightly that authority is not a matter of persuasive argumentation, soliciting consent. Instead, authority makes sense more in the way, okay, here's the thesis. Tell me if you think this is right. Authority makes sense more in the way that an accomplished piece of music or poetry or painting makes sense than in a way a syllogism makes sense. It thus justifies itself. It's a kind of internal self-justification. And this is why the order is not coercively imposed, but we might say proposed, communicated from within. Authority, in its very being, prior to any specific directive or pronouncement, speaks to the heart and mind at once, inviting them to a higher order, a better existence, predisposing them, as it were, and giving them the inner power to conform themselves. Now, once we catch sight of the connection between beauty and authority, it seems to me we can't help but start seeing it everywhere. I've started seeing it everywhere. It's almost frightening. Nathan Poole's famous biblical commentary describing a passage from Jeremiah speaks of, quote, the mysterious countenance of princes and magistrates, apt to strike a great awe and terror upon children. The word countenance, face, originally meant outward appearance. We can see this, there's a German equivalent to the word countenance, Antlitz, which actually means a reflection of light. The face is a reflection of a light that radiates outward. What does this mean? The countenance of princes is the authoritative radiance that belongs naturally to the ruling power. Shakespeare appears to have found it inconceivable that royal blood, even when hidden through historical accident and mistaken identity, could ever fail to shine forth in beautiful form, a noble countenance. The word noble itself is related to the word notable, which means conspicuously manifestive. To be noble is an interior quality, but it's an interior quality that's manifest. There's a connection between nobility and authority. The connection's everywhere, even the Psalm 145, the last line, that all the sons of men may know your power and the glory of your kingdom's magnificence. Again, shining forth. Modern scholars dismiss these things in Shakespeare as remnants of primitive medieval notions. But one might suggest that these scholars do so because they have lost a sense of what beauty, the intrinsic meaning of beauty, as something inherently meaningful. We're all, of course, familiar with the great, in some sense, supreme pomp and circumstance that has attended the royal office from time immemorial, even after we've left these apparently primitive notions behind. In a book called The Kingdom and the Glory, an Italian philosopher, Giorgio Agamben, who's got lots of problematic ideas. He's a troubling figure, but he knows history well. He's documented the significance of the manifestation of power, distinct from its simple exercise, that has always been part of political rule in the pre-modern world. Why? The outward appearance, beauty, is part of the meaning of authority, and authority operates as a form of beauty. It's precisely in this way, precisely as authority, I want to suggest, that power can be contemplated. I think it's difficult for us, because we live in a bourgeois age, to think about the regalia exhibited by figures of authority as anything but the ostentation of wealth to which universal and so inescapable self-interest is inclined when it has power. But the phenomenon, I suggest, looks very different if we look at it as an expression of the profound connection that authority has with beauty. In this case, the physical manifestation, the visibility, is intrinsic to the meaning of the authority, which is meant, as it were, to shine out to the ends of the sphere of its responsibility. And this is how it communicates order in a manner that distinguishes authority from power. Perhaps the most compelling evidence for the connection between beauty and authority is in a contrary example. So the figure who became something of a patron saint for various anti-authoritarian movements in history arrives in what is more or less the original work of Western literature, namely the Iliad. Early in the narrative, I'm sure you all remember this, Homer introduces Thersites. Do you remember him? He's a character who attempts to thwart the king's commands during the siege of Troy, and he appeals to the concerned party's rational self-interest. It's clear, so this character was actually taken by historical movements as a patron saint, Thersites. Okay, it's clear that Homer meant to present him as the very antitype of authority. And to do so, he describes precisely his outward appearance in greater detail than he does for any other character in the poem. In Latimer's translation, this is how Homer characterizes him, quote, "This was the ugliest man who came beneath Ilion. He was bandy-legged and went lame of one foot, with shoulders stooped and drawn together over his chest, and above this his skull went up to a point, with the wool grown sparsely upon it." So Homer wants us to grasp that he's the opposite of authority, and he does so brilliantly by presenting him as bearing not a trace of beauty. Think about that. Okay, part 3, last part, authority and symbol. Interpreting authority in the order of beauty helps us to see, I think, one of its most decisive features, which I want to call its symbolic function. Or to put the matter more precisely, its essential reality as a symbol, understanding this latter term in a very robust sense. So yesterday I gave a presentation on the nature of symbol. I'm not going to rehearse any of that. I'm just going to, the kind of main point that drawn from that for this context. Properly understood, a symbol is more than just a sign that conveys conceptualizable information. Such a purely semantic function belongs to the rationalistic reduction of symbol to allegory, where each element stands for some discrete meaning, which could be grasped just as well on its own, apart from the sign that happened to convey it. A symbol is something much denser, more mysterious, more redolent of a communicative presence. To speak in the language of sacramental theology, a symbol affects in a certain respect what it signifies, which is to say it does not simply point to a meaning it itself is not, which is what allegory does, but makes that meaning present within it, without for all that eliminating the transcendence of the meaning. The symbol is, we might say, the embodiment of meaning. According to its etymology, a symbolon, from sin, with or together, and balan, to throw or cast, indicates a joining into one, a unification of what lies apart. And this is why it's the direct etymological opposite of the diabolical, dia, which one of the meanings is to set in two directions, to set apart, to cast apart. The symbolic and the diabolical are opposites. The symbol joins into one. It unifies what lies apart. So on the one hand, a symbol joins together in intelligible meaning and physical presence. On the other hand, a symbol joins many people together in the celebration of that meaning, the meaning that unites them. Now, if we think about authority in relation to that description of symbol, it's pretty obvious why authority is essentially symbolic, it seems to me. I mean, I think in a way it's a paradigm, a real paradigm of what a symbol is. How is this so? Most obviously, what does an authority do? The highest role of authority is to gather the many into one, to form a community. That's symbolane, to gather together into one, and to constitute human community. But at a deeper level, as we've seen from that quotation from Krieger, one of the things that most characterizes authority is its mediating role. It translates the higher spiritual principles of order into the lower realm of being, which is to say it joins these two dimensions together, symbolane. Joins together the intelligible or spiritual level with the physical level, and in that sense embodies meaning. In doing this, it represents the higher to the lower, or in other words, it makes the higher order present and effective here below. As the recent coronation of Charles III has reminded us, every aspect of the royal office abounds with symbols, from the crown to the color and style of the vestments to the scepter to the orb, and on and on and on, every little detail. The ceremony itself was an ancient, sacred liturgy in which every gesture had some significance. But the central symbol is the king himself. His very person is a symbol. And it's this, his being a symbol, that represents his principal role as a figure of authority. Queen Elizabeth II once remarked that her duty consisted, quote, not in doing, but in being. To be sure, it's right and good for an authority to teach in a certain respect and to command, that is, to illuminate minds and guide action, as I'll suggest in more detail in a second. But these acts are properly authoritative to the extent that they emanate, they radiate from one who is an authority. Authority commands, but first of all, it's a commanding presence. It teaches, but it's first of all a light that enlightens and so enables things to be seen. By viewing authority as principally symbolic in this sense, and in particular as lying in the order of beauty, we avoid both the practical and the intellectual reductions that we saw earlier eliminate authority. On the one hand, we see the inadequacy of thinking of authority as merely practical. A well-regarded book published, I think, by Oxford University Press, The Authority of Law, begins this way. Authority is a practical concept. This means that questions of who has authority over whom are practical questions. They bear on what one ought to do. Okay, true enough. But it's true that authority bears on practice, but this doesn't make it merely a practical manner, I want to suggest. What authority brings to bear on practice is a transcendent light. It represents spiritual values, you might say, a higher order, which it mediates to practice and gives that practice something supra-pragmatic, something more than just a utilitarian sense. It gives it a genuinely human meaning. As symbolic authority's first purpose is to open up a horizon in which to think and act. And this horizon opens up and outlines the proper shape of human existence. So part of this task is establishing the core meaning of things that make up human existence. And notice I'm emphasizing protecting the meaning of things. We tend to think of authority as having to do with management and arrangement, but we have to recognize authority actually has to safeguard the meaning of things, even more basically, I think. The meaning of things that's presupposed in all of our interaction. And this is because the field of authority is precisely that of what is presupposed, what we take for granted, what's already there, providing the ground for our activity. So authority doesn't principally teach things. As symbolic, it reveals their meaningfulness. And it does so in a way that doesn't just appeal to the mind, but to something more than the mind. It's more than just a conveyor of information or concepts. Instead, as I suggested, a symbol is an embodiment of meaning. Specifically, as beautiful, a symbol speaks to our whole person, body and soul. And indeed, it speaks to our heart in the biblical sense of heart, lev, the interior unity, center of a person. It speaks within us in that way. It does not so much tell us something discrete as it opens us, again, from within to the fact that there's something meaningful that needs to be observed and listened to and safeguarded and responded to and conformed to. We might think here of a liturgical act that we may have seen. Maybe you watched the coronation of Charles. And when we watch that, we can tell it's full of meaning. We might not be able to say what the meaning is, but the very sort of symbolic nature of it tells us there's something that we ought to. It disposes us. It calls our attention to pay attention. See, there's going to be something meaningful here. That's what authority is most basically meant to do, I'm suggesting. And this is what it means to say that the symbol doesn't just speak to us, like tell us something, it moves us. Vision and rapture, it moves us. We might say that authority doesn't dispose us in a specific way, but predisposes us. And again, the pre is essential. It's what comes before and enables our thinking and doing in a properly human way. It's a fundamental and taken for granted predisposition and presupposition. Just as it opens us to understand, authority opens us to follow direction and command, makes us docile, whatever the command might be given. And because it does both, it allows us to follow commands as a whole human being, a dignified person, rather than a mere object of power. So authority, as we've seen, bears witness to a higher intelligible order, speaking to our intelligence, auctor, and it therefore enlivens us, allowing that order to take root in us and bear actual fruit in our lives, augere. Okay, conclusion here. In our last discussion of the matter, in our discussion of the matter, I've tended to focus principally on the highest symbol of authority, on the king. And you might wonder, okay, what does that matter to us today? Kings are hard to come by these days. In the 20th century, we don't run into kings that often. And this fact, first of all, I want to suggest might say something more about us than about kings. That's something to think about. But however that may be, I want to just make two comments in conclusion in relation to that, which I think is an important objection. So first, what has been said about the supreme ruler, I think should be applied to all levels of authority, all kinds of authority in an analogous way, in their own way, whatever that happens to be. So what this means is that we have to come to recognize the symbolic and representative role that authority is charged to play in every realm. And it's a role that authority, I think, inevitably plays, whether we want it to or not. It functions this way, whether we want it to or not. So what does this mean? It means that a leader, for instance, we might think here of Andrew Kern, is first of all meant to be an exemplar, right? Before being a director of activity. He's meant to show in himself the order he's responsible to communicate in a manner that inspires and elevates. As symbolic, the actual presence of the authority is something indispensable, as is the attentiveness to form. Perhaps most contrary to contemporary assumptions, the authority is meant to illuminate the mind, illuminate the mind as much as, or maybe even more basically than direct behavior. Its most basic charge is to lift one's gaze to higher things. That's the first role of an authority, is to lift one's gaze, to recall those things as that from which we take our bearings. To be an authority, one must, before all else, radiate a higher goodness and truth in one's being. And the radiance of goodness and truth is beauty. So be beautiful and rule naturally. The authority has a responsibility to make evident, and if need be, to safeguard, to defend, to do battle for the truth of things around which all behavior turns. And in doing so, he has to keep in mind that the order he seeks to communicate and defend is ultimately not an order he has invented. It's an order he receives, to which he himself is called to bear faithful witness. There's therefore something sacred, a divine aura of sorts, in all authority. This luminous character of authority is a divine, there's something, God is present in there in some way. Not just in the highest, most sublime levels, but analogously everywhere that order is fruitfully generated. As St. Paul said, all authority comes from God. All authority comes from God. Okay. Second, finally, what light does all this shed on the general crisis of authority that I spoke about at the beginning? It seems to me, without pretending to have achieved some definitive solution to the problem, maybe we've come to see that the efforts to remedy it, to the extent that remedy is possible, would take what is no doubt a different direction than we might have expected. Typically, one responds to the loss of respect for authority by inciting fear, presenting it in as forceful and threatening a way as possible the consequences of failure to obey. It's interesting, Thomas Hobbes, one of the figures who most decisively exemplifies the death of authority, as we've been presenting it, insisted on the indispensable function of capital punishment for the constitution of public political sovereignty. So for him, power can be absolute only if it has control over our highest fear, which is the fear of death. That's what gives the authority highest power. But we ought to see that this fear, which is meant to provoke, I was going to say inspire, but inspire is exactly the wrong word. It's meant to provoke something like docility. That's the diabolical substitute for authority, for the symbolic predisposition inspired by beauty. A sensitivity to authority can be restored not by ratcheting up threats and rolling heads, as tempting as that might be, but above all by instilling love, the response to beauty, educating in beauty, recovering a sense of symbol, or to use theological language, a sacramental sense of reality, in which all things show forth the grandeur of God, which flames out like shining from shook foil, as Hopkins beautifully said. To relearn to see the glory of God, communicated precisely in the material creation, a glory reflected in and so augmented by the countenance of human authority, is the proper response to our crisis. This task falls in a special way, of course, to teachers, but also and most basically to the parents, who are a growing person's first authority. Thank you. There is time for a question or two if anybody wants to object. It's always more fun if there are objections. Yes. Right. Right. Yeah. 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 You know, it's an interesting. I wonder. The problem is that we have lost a sense of kingship simply around the world. So even the best example that we have, and it's interesting. I mean, England is not the only place that has kings, but if you are at the royal family, but if you hear the word royal family, we all think of England. It's kind of, they sort of represent that for us. But it's changed there too. The king doesn't understand, that doesn't have an authoritative, precisely. You know, all of the real. He's been deprived of power, and that seems to have, in some way, attenuated his capacity to represent authority. But it is interesting to me that a trace of it cannot but remain and cannot but be communicated. It's always intrigued me that, as a general rule, I'm not sure where things stand right now, but you know, the policemen in England famously never carried guns. You know, so they would just tell people to stop. And you wonder, I mean, that's sort of, we chuckle, it's impossible to conceive, but it would make sense in a culture that just has a certain natural sense of what authority is, that might have a certain power. Maybe there's a connection. But I think we need to, you know, and we can't live without kings. We talk about Christ the King of the cosmos. What does that mean to us anymore? How can we know what that means if we don't know what a king is and we've never experienced? And we have such a desperate need for kings. I really think this is a natural need, and I think it is so deep in us that if we can't have them in reality, we have to make them up. And why is it that kings and queens so fill the literature that we read to our children? I think that's, and there's something about the king that speaks to us. You know, in this crowd, we all love the book, The Lord of the Rings, right? The novel. You know, there's so many themes in that, but the culminating, what's the third volume called? Right? Return of the King. In a way, the whole thing is about kingship. And notice it doesn't say the return of the chairman of the board. You know, or even just the return of the president, you know, none of that speaks to us in the same sort of way. Why? Because those are figures of power. They're not authorities in this deep sense that I think we need to enliven everything about, you know, all the dimensions of our existence. So that's a very long answer to your question, but yes. Okay. Coercive power and persuasion. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It is a good thing, right? And I don't want to, right, and it's a good thing in the way that coercive power is obviously not. That's only in the case of necessity. But what I want to suggest is, of course, persuasion by argument is a good thing. But it's different. I just want to insist that it's different from authority. And if you try to instill order simply through argumentation, where people then would have to give their consent, what you end up is actually a group of individuals. Authority is something that transcends simple assent. There is an element of obedience to authority that argumentation doesn't have. When I understand an argument and I do it, I'm doing it because I see that it's right. I'm not doing it because it has authority. And there's an important place for that, but what I want to suggest is if that's all we have, then the bonds that connect us tend to thin out and disappear. And so we need to have something that is persuasive in the way that something beautiful is persuasive. Or, you know, this is why the greatest leaders, they enact a noble deed. And what happens? Everyone wants to follow. There's something that inspires. You want to follow someone. Well, why is that? I mean, that's an interesting thing. But it seems to me this is part of the genuine human experience of what authority is and how the glory So glory is a word like beauty. It's an aesthetic thing. Why glory and nobility and beauty are inseparable from that need.
So then it sounds like the difference would be Winston Churchill had to use persuasion to get the other, the equals,
Right.
about something, but then he inspired the population.
Yes.
Or the queen inspired
Yes.
to persuade.
Nice.
That,
That's right. Right. So persuasion, as Godwin says, is among equals. But there's a hierarchy that's part of authority, that's essential to authority. And notice, I mean, Winston Churchill is a great example. I mean, he spoke beautifully. Think about, we tend to think that that's just rhetorical, people will say. It's just sort of manipulation, you use fancy words to impress people. But no, there's actually something crucially important about speaking well for a figure of authority, and in fact having a dignified appearance. That in fact in deep ways enters into the souls of people and tunes them up in a way that is indispensable for real human community. That's what I think we're tending to lose. Yes, sir, in the red. Yeah. Prudence. Oh, wisdom. Right, exactly. It is. You're exactly right about that. That's and this is why we associate wisdom in a special way with authorities. An authority without wisdom is a failed authority. Yeah, I mean, being able to understand and then communicate. Now, wisdom as a principle is something each of us is called to have. What is added to that with an authority is that's wisdom that is displayed as an ordering principle for a community. And that sort of takes it up a notch. But you're absolutely right to see the connection. Yeah. Maybe one more? Yes, in the back. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, actually, this allows me to say something that I think people find shocking, but I'm proud of this insight. I think it's really true. Okay, authority cannot be abused. Authority cannot be abused any more than wisdom can be abused. If it's abused, it's not authority, it's power. Power can be abused. What does authority mean? Authority means to bear witness to a higher principle of order. If it's being abused, it's not. And therefore, in the name of authority, and this gets very delicate. This has generated a vast ocean of literature and political philosophy. What are the principles that justify rebellion? Because notice, justify rebellion. What does that mean? That means when make rebellion an act of justice. That's a tricky question if you think of the ruling principle is responsible for justice and laws as articulating what's just. It becomes a very tricky thing. Nevertheless, I think we have to say in principle that precisely in the name of the higher principles that an authority is called to bear witness to, we might need to rebel against the authority in certain circumstances. The form that takes when you understand it as an act of justice, I think, is different. Like the French Revolution with the beheading of the king and then the kind of violence that generated for years is not an example of a proper, it seems to me, even though some kind of action was certainly called for. But then these get to be prudential matters, yeah. Thank you for that question. And thank you all for your kind attention.